Good evening, everyone. It is once again Ted the Speed Learner, and I hope each and every one of you is having a very Merry Christmas Eve. Now, I know that Christmas Eve is starting to wind down, but your learning's not over yet. Oh, no. Because I'm now going to continue my review of Danica Mckellar's book, Math Doesn't Suck. And in Chapter 2, if I recall correctly, the topic of greatest common factor was discussed in that book. Okay, so what do I got to say about all that? Well, I can appreciate you using romantic social interactions to help young ladies in remembering the term greatest common factor. But I prefer using Latin etymology to help people remember terms. And you're going to quickly see why. Okay? The word common comes from the same Latin word used for the word commune. So let's imagine that we have a commune full of priests and nuns. Okay, so we have this commune, it's full of priests and nuns, and the greatest priest in that commune is the greatest common factor. But we're going to use a better example than that as we continue with this particular video. Now, the etymology of the word factor has to deal with commerce, okay? Specifically, someone who represents a company. Now, we're going to imagine that these priests and these nuns are going to start selling super vacuum cleaners, okay? And you're going to see this later on in the video. Now, about 50 years ago, people used to sell encyclopedias door to door. The problem is they don't do that anymore. And why don't they? Well, mainly because the internet has taken over the place of the encyclopedias. But they do sell vacuum cleaners door to door. Not many companies do this anymore, but there are a few vacuum sweeper companies that actually do this. And that's why we're going to use this as an example. Now then, different people need different vacuum cleaner features. Some vacuums can only remove small particles and dust bunnies and that kind of stuff, while other vacuum cleaners can remove staples, they can remove paper clips, you name it, okay? They actually make different vacuum cleaners for, say, on the smaller end it would be good for a mobile home, whereas on the bigger end it would be good for a shop, or for an office building, or possibly even a church. See what I mean? Different buildings, different needs. Okay, now then. Alright, so we're going to imagine that these nuns come to our house with either a catalog full of different vacuum cleaners, or they maybe even bring a vacuum cleaner or two to demonstrate the vacuum cleaners to us. Okay. So then, now, in the book, you mentioned 3 different techniques for finding the greatest common factor. I object to the first one, and here's the reason why. To remember all of those factors of all of those numbers, and you're talking about lots and lots of numbers that have existed over the ages, it's just too complicated. And I feel that that's really not the best way to go. And your this third example that you throw in the book, I just feel that's a bit complicated too. So we're going to go with the second one. The second one I think is the very best one, but I'm going to do it in a slightly different way. We're going to use prime numbers, okay? Now, prime numbers are basically numbers that can only be divided by themselves and by the number 1. Otherwise, they can't be divided at all. This includes the 2, the 3, the 5, the 7, and the 11. Okay? Now, how are we going to remember those specific 5 prime numbers? Well, if you are familiar with the works of Harry Lorraine, what you're going to do is you're going to imagine in your head that the nuns have not only brought vacuum cleaners, but they've also brought with them a nominal kettle. And if you are familiar with Harry Lorraine's works, you'll be able to decipher that rather quickly. Okay. So, we're going to imagine that these nuns have brought us 2 vacuum cleaners. Whoops, let's get that off of there. One has 75 features. The other has only 30. But there are features on both of these vacuum cleaners. Okay, both of these vacuum cleaners have certain features. It's just this one has more features than this one. Okay. Now then, how are we going to find the factors of 75? Well, I'm going to show you exactly how we're going to find this. Obviously, we can't divide 75 by the number 2, but we can divide it by the number 3. Alrighty. How do we get this? Well, 3 times 2 is 6. Bring down the 5, and 3 times 5 is 15. That's how you get that. So, we're now going to have a factor of 3. So now we have the number 25. Can this actually be divided by 3? No, it can't. But it can be divided by 5. 5 times 5 is 25, so now you have 3 factors, 3, 5, and 5. Okay, so that's the first number. So the factors of 75 are 3, 5, and 5. What about 30? Well, can 2 divide 30? Well, yes, it can. So 15 times 2 is 30. So now we have our first factor, which is a 2. Of the remaining number 15, can 2 divide 15? Well, no, of course not. But can 3? Why, yes. 3 times 5 is 15. So, what is the greatest common factor of 75 and 30? Well, I'm going to tell you. What we're going to do is we're going to circle the 3 right here and the 3 right here. Why? Because there is a 3 and the factors of this and this as well. What we're also going to do is we're going to circle this and we're going to circle this. Why? Because there's a 5 here and there's a 5 over here. So, if we take 3 times 5, 3 times 5 is 15, and 15 is a factor of 75, and it's also a factor of 30. Alright? And that's how you get the greatest common factor. Now then, in the book, the term relatively prime is mentioned. I know I'm getting blue ink all over myself. Okay. What is a number, what is the term relatively prime? Well, the way to remember that is, let's imagine that you have 2 children. One's a boy, one's a girl. And they have 2 very distinct personalities. The only thing that's similar about the both of them is that they have the same parents. They have the same mother, they have the same father, but they are not anywhere close to being the same children. Not at all. Okay, so let's suppose we have the numbers the number 12 and the number 13. Now, 13 is a prime number, but 12 is not. But are these 2 numbers relatively prime to each other? Absolutely, because there is no other number that's going to divide both 12 and 13 other than 1. Okay? Yes, there's plenty of numbers that will divide 12, but there are no other numbers that will divide 13 other than 1. Okay? And that's where we get this relatively prime. Okay? Obviously, they're not both prime, but they are prime to each other because the number 1 can divide 12 and the number 1 can divide 13, but no other number can divide both 12 and 13. Getting it? And that's how you can remember that. You say, well, wait a minute. Well, let's see. Let's think of another number here that can actually be divided. How about 12 and 25? Okay? Well, that's not really a good example either. How about 12 and 21? Let's try that one for a second. Let's see. Yes. Okay. This is a better example. Well, that's not really a good example either. I'm really bombing out on this one, because because 3 is a factor of both 12 and 21, so that's not going to work either. How about 35? Okay. All right. As far as I know, as far as I know, there are numbers that can divide 12, there are numbers that can divide 35, but as far as I know, there's no number that can divide both 12 and 35. I just checked that just to be sure, but there are no numbers that I know of that can divide both 12 and 35. And that's a relatively prime situation as well. Okay. If I'm wrong, you are more than welcome to correct me on this, but I don't think I am. And it took me a while to figure out a number, because I was like, well, this isn't working, but we figured something out anyway. This is a better way to remember the terms relatively prime and greatest common factor, at least as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, I'm going to continue my review of your math book in another video. I want to wish each and every one of you a very Merry Christmas Eve. And I wanted to also say that after the next couple of 3 videos, I'm going to stop all this for tonight. So, I want to thank you very much for tuning in. I will tell you more in a future video, so I'd like for you to stay tuned.